All right, so now we're going to move along the game board. We talked last time about how individual people have goals, concern, problems, and ideas that they want to see entered into the political process. But one person has very little voice, and so therefore they must engage in linkage institutions. So linkage institutions are anything that are going to make people's voices louder so that the policymakers will listen to them. And so the first one we're going to talk about today is interest group. So an interest group is an organization of people with similar policy goals who enter the political process to achieve those goals. So again, an individual person has a very quiet voice. It's not like if I have a problem, I can go down to the White House and talk to the president about what I want to see go through Congress or go through whatever. Likewise, I can't even go to the governor, much less the mayor of the city wouldn't even listen to me like that. Um, and so basically, these are people who have the same policy goals. I mean, there's all kinds of distinctions we can make. And they're not like political parties because they don't seek to run people for office. They're pursuing policy. And so, in order to make my voice louder, I might find people who agree with me on certain political issues, will band together, will make an organization, and then instead of just one voice, we might have 50,000 voices. And instead of just having a little bit of money from one person, we might have a ton of money from all the members. Money and numbers are the statistics that matter in politics, and so that can give you a louder voice. It can connect you to the policymakers, hence the term linkage institution. Since 1959, we've seen the number of interest groups explode, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, about whether or not that's a good thing. And today, 90% of interest groups in America are actually headquartered in Washington, D.C., which makes sense because if their job is to voice political opinions of their people, members of their group, then they're going to want to go straight to the policymakers, look at them face to face, and therefore you want to be centered in Washington. So here are the main theories about groups in America. I mentioned that the number of groups in America has skyrocketed, and in a democracy that makes sense, that people have an agenda to be accomplished, and they do that better in numbers, and so it makes perfect sense that we'd see an explosion in the number of interest groups in America. But there are theories on the impact that these number of groups has on democracy. So, for example, the pluralist is going to say that groups are good, that this is a healthy development in democracy. The more groups we have, the more opportunities for individual to have a group with which to affiliate. They can have a louder voice, and it gives them a better chance to meet their policy goals. Everybody gets a piece of the pie at some point. This is like a game. You win some, you lose some, and if you do lose, you try again the next time. And that's kind of a rosy, optimistic look at American democracy, that it's a good thing, that everyone's competing, and that it's a fair game by and large, and that everybody can win or lose. The hyperpluralist, on the other hand, is going to say that groups are actually a bad thing, or the explosion in the number of groups. The hyperpluralist is going to say there's so many groups out there today that really they just cancel each other out. They're stomping on each other. It's a cacophony of sounds, just everybody yelling and bickering. And the politicians can't possibly make all of these groups happy. If the point of an interest group is to seek a policy goal, but that there are so many groups out there that the politicians can't possibly make everyone happy. And if they do, it's only going to be a select few. Then in reality, the vast majority of the time, groups are going to be losers because there's just too many of them. And then there's a third group called the elite theorists who say groups don't even really matter. We're putting too much of an optimistic outlook on democracy. The elite theorist is going to question even the concept of democracy and say, citizens and their voices and their groups and their participation in the system, all that really doesn't matter. Your one vote doesn't matter. Your $10 contribution doesn't matter. Your little group doesn't matter. All that really matters is that there are a handful of people in this country with real power, whether they be intellectual elites or corporate elites, the people with the money and the people with the authority and the influence. They're the ones who call all the shots. They're the ones who decide what policies are executed in Washington. And so therefore, it doesn't matter if you form a group. It doesn't matter if there's too many groups. All that really matters is, what do the power holders want? And of course, this is a downright pessimistic look at our democracy and how things get done in society. So you may see yourself falling in any one of these categories. And in fact, you could be in multiple categories. You could think in some areas, pluralism does work, where groups can compete. In some areas, it is a hyperpluralist situation where all we have is just gridlock, where everybody's canceling each other out. And then again, there are some things where the elites call the shots and none of us really matter. So it can be very complicated on how we think about our democracy and the role of groups within that democracy. Another thing we need to look at with groups is the idea of actuals and potentials. So anytime you have a group, you have memberships, and with political interest groups, you have membership lists, and usually people have to make some kind of political contribution or financial contribution, union dues or whatever. And so this creates a certain phenomenon where you actually have to have skin in the game. But at the same time, the whole purpose of the group is to generate benefits for the group. And so when we say we have actual members, these would be people who are actually doing the work in the group. Okay, so if you're talking about a labor union, that is a group that tries to amplify the voice of workers, then the people who are actually doing the negotiations with politicians, who are making the contracts and doing the real work of the group, they would be the labor union leaders, would be the actual members. Potential members, on the other hand, are those who get the benefits of the things that the actuals negotiate, but actually don't necessarily do the work. And so these would be the workers of the union as opposed to the leadership of the union. And so obviously they're the ones who are going to be contributing money, and they're the ones who are providing the numbers, but they actually don't have the decision-making power, or have they done the work on behalf of the union itself. And so this creates a certain circumstance where we have the free rider problem. And that is, people get benefits when they're not actually doing any of the work. And we've all been in a situation where we're members of a group, either a formal group or an informal group. I mean, it could be in a classroom where you're in groups of 3 and one person does all the work, the other 2 don't do anything, and everybody gets the same grade. That's the situation that we have with political groups as well. In fact, Olson created a law of large group that says the bigger the group, the bigger the free rider problem. It doesn't proportionally grow. You always have a very small fraction of the group doing the real work. And the bigger that group is, that number who does the work stays small, and the number of free riders grows. In addition, the dividends, and thus each person's share, will be smaller. So the people who are the actuals can really only deliver so much, and the more free riders you have, the smaller cut everybody gets. And so this is a problem, and this is a limitation of interest groups that we need to be aware of as we continue looking into these linkage institutions about how they're trying to influence policymakers and the people that are really doing the work on the behalf of a large number of people. Lobbying is a major element about how groups function. So, and sometimes people get loosey-goosey with this term and say that this is what interest groups do. They lobby. Well, it's one thing that they do. A lobbyist is usually an attorney or somebody closely affiliated with the law, or a person closely affiliated with a particular sector of the economy or a particular issue. And what they are hired by interest groups to go to Washington and directly try to influence the policymakers, meaning face to face. And so, really, it's a way that interest groups try to influence policymakers with words and through having meetings and making agreements, much of which we'll talk later on about. Most lobbying firms that are hired by interest groups are going to be headquartered in Washington. In fact, there's a street, K Street, where they're most populated. And we get this name from the same kind of thing. Back in the old days, when Congress would meet in Washington, they didn't actually live there like they do now. They would come, do their business, and then go home. And then later on in the year, come back another time, do their business, and go home. They would stay in hotels when they came to Washington. And so, if you really wanted to leave your mark as an interest group or an individual in those days, you would try to meet policymakers in the lobbies of their hotels. And that's where we get the name lobbyists. So, again, as we'll see later, there's a relationship that will develop between lobbyists and the policymakers and the people that are executing law in the government. And so they're going to make deals where everybody is scratching each other's back. And so one thing that lobbyists are going to do on behalf of their interest groups is to be a source of information for the policymakers. Remember, these people who write laws in Congress aren't always experts in the areas on which they're making policy. So, for example, an environmentalist lobby is going to go to Washington and maybe be dealing with members of Congress who are not experts on environmental policymaking. So they can provide them with statistics and information and say, what we really need is this, what we really need is that. They can be, in a more direct manner, they can actually be the ones writing the laws. Remember, there's only so many hours in the day, and members of Congress usually aren't the ones who are writing laws. And in reality, it's the lobbyists and the groups who have experts that are going to be literally writing the legislation, or at least the proposals. They may also help members of Congress formulate campaign strategy and say, if you want the votes of our group, then you're going to pursue these policy goals, you're going to say these things, we'll donate a certain amount of campaign contributions to your campaign. These kind of things can be established as well. A couple other ways that interest groups function. Electioneering is where interest groups give donations to campaigns of incumbents or even challengers that share their policy goals, or at least they think possibly could share their policy goals. So anytime you're talking electioneering, you're talking anything to help a candidate win office. And so, remember, this is the whole point. This is where groups are trying to get policymakers inside of Washington that are going to deliver on the goods that they want. And so this could be, promising votes, but mainly campaign contributions, running commercials can be part of that as well. Getting politicians to listen is usually accomplished through large campaign donation. That's definitely true. Litigation is another thing they can do, which is a fancy word for going to court. And so if you're an interest group, especially groups like civil rights groups or environmental groups, if you can't get Congress to do something, which is your normal means, you may try to get through the judiciary, file lawsuits, get the courts to hand down decisions that are going to benefit you and your policy goals. You can run public relation campaigns, which is to say run commercials on TV. So every now and then you'll see commercials for interest groups like AARP or the NRA. Big groups will run ads on behalf of themselves, but also during campaign season, they'll do public relations commercials for candidates, which is, again, getting back to electioneering. They may attack politicians or bring attention to a certain circumstance or criticize a law. There's lots of things that they can do. So, for example, I list one here. The American Medical Association ran lots of commercials back in the early 90s trying to skew public opinion against Clinton's proposed health care plan. And they were successful. The law never even came to a vote. And groups also can engage in public demonstration, which is to say they may petition, they may protest, have rallies, boycott. Sometimes these things kind of morph into civil disobedience where they're actually breaking the law. And so, in some of the biggest moments in American history where we see activism and big changes were done by large groups. So now some types of labor unions that we need to be aware of. The first one would be a labor union. And so this is a group that has membership made up of workers of a certain sector of the economy. So factory workers or farmers. Farmers have the United Farm Workers, for example. Electricians have their own unions. Service employees, you name it, and there's a union for them. So what they're trying to do is to try to influence policymakers in the government to give better wages to their workers or safer conditions or fewer hours or more vacation time or laws regarding their industry that are going to benefit workers. So, for example, there are 14 million workers that belong to the AFL-CIO, which is the American Federation of Labor and Commerce Industrial Organizations, the largest workers union that there is, and that's actually a coalition of many unions that fall under this big umbrella. So labor unions have had better days than they've had at this moment. They in the past, going back to the Great Depression and other times earlier in the 20th century, they had huge numbers and they really delivered on the goods for their workers on many occasions. Today, union membership is definitely dropping, and there have been recent developments in the law and in the courts that have actually downplayed the role of unions. And so there may be a time in the future where we see unions become obsolete, but not any time in the near future. What unions will do to prevent free riding is to create a union shop, which means if you want a job, you have to join the union after you get that job. It's illegal to force people to be part of the union beforehand, but after you get a new job, you have to join the union. That way, everybody who is a member and has a particular job has to pay union dues, which means they're paying their fair share. And everybody's got skin in the game because everybody in the union would benefit from whatever the negotiating team comes up with when they do a contract. Business groups also have groups. Large banks, insurance companies, multinationals, they all form political action committees, which we'll see much more of soon. So that allows them to make campaign contributions at election time. But they also form groups in order to put pressure on policymakers so that their businesses can get some kind of competitive edge or maximize their profits or lower their tax burden or something like that, get subsidies for their industry. So in other words, farmer groups are going to try to get subsidies or get cash from the government to grow certain kinds of crops. Anything like that. So some examples would be the National Association of Manufacturers or the Chamber of Commerce, who you've probably heard of before. All of these business groups would petition the policymakers for these kinds of things. Environmental groups have been really exploding since the 1970s, since the first time we had Earth Day. And of course, they're going to petition Congress to basically pass a bunch of laws that are going to lower pollution rates, protect wildlife and wilderness areas, population control. They're going to do things like oppose coal mining and promote green energy, limit nuclear power, limit oil. The thing about environmentalism and the groups that pursue policy on their behalf, we'll see that they go in direct conflict with the energy producers, because energy producers are businesses that want to maximize profits, but if you're an oil person or a coal person, then your industry is directly leading to pollution. And so this is a perfect example of how we can wind up with gridlock in Washington. On the one hand, we want to make the environmentalists happy and give them the policies that they seek. But at the same time, we need the energy. And we want it cheap as possible. And so we're going to do policies for the energy companies as well. And so here we have two groups that are mutually opposed that want the exact opposite things, and the policymakers have to deliver what both of these groups want at the same time. This is a perfect example of policy gridlock. And the hyperpluralist would jump on that and say, that doesn't make any sense. But it happens all the time. Civil rights groups have been prevalent ever since World War II. Groups like the NAACP are going to fight for civil rights for their members, whether it be in voting or in housing or jobs or education. And for a long time, affirmative action was the big thing that civil rights group would promote, along with things like minority hiring and welfare for the poor. So, it depends on the time period you're talking about, but these groups have been instrumental in forcing Congress to pass things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These days, things like police brutality and unfair enrollments in schools or things like that are going to be the thing that civil rights groups are going to be fighting for, usually either before Congress through lobbyists or by filing lawsuits in the courts. Women also have a strong network of interest groups. Like in the old days, it was for the fight to gain suffrage, which was NASA, and it was the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Nowadays, since the civil rights era, they've been fighting for things like equal hiring or equal pay, equal promotions. And there are many women's groups who are deeply connected to the political process, like the National Organization of Women, League of Women Voters. Women, remember, are half the population, and they have a very, very loud voice. And so they're definitely a group that we should mention as far as types of groups. There are a smattering of other kinds of groups that we're going to have. We might call one set public interest lobbies. And this is where we don't necessarily have a membership. Meaning you don't necessarily belong to a public interest lobby. The membership of a public interest lobby is everybody in the country. So, for example, Ralph Nader, who's a guy who'd run for president every now and then in a previous generation, he basically fought for the rights of auto consumers to have safe cars. He was the seatbelt guy. And, he had an organization, but it was entirely devoted to, potential members or members who didn't really, there was no member dues being paid, there were no membership lists. But if he got what he wanted, which was seatbelts in every car, and he succeeded in that, the benefit went around to everybody in the country. You've got religious groups, Christian Coalition and CARE, which are Muslim groups, and they're going to advocate for things like religious liberty or civil rights for certain religious groups. And then you got community groups that try to launch political change at the local level, which we might call grassroots organization. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of groups out there, and just about everybody in the country belongs to either a formal group where you're a member and you pay into the group, or an informal group. You may just identify yourself as someone from such and such state, or someone who believes in X, or someone who wants to see Y. We can have these informal groups too. And you'll hear politicians talk in terms of these hypothetical groups. And so everybody belongs to a group in one way or another.